Welcome to today's Leeds Biomedical Research Centre's seminar series. Today, we are very lucky to have with us Professor Anthony Redmond, who is going to talk today about not driving yourself mad and how to deal with rejection. So thank you very much, Anthony, and welcome to the BRC Research Seminar Series.
Hello, and thank you for having me. And for full disclosure, I should say thank you for having me a second time, because this is a re-recording of a webinar that was originally delivered on the 16th of March and wasn't recorded. Some of the slides I was using had some sort of clip arts and bits and bobs that we had to go and check out the copyright. So this is a re-recording of the webinar with a slightly more conservative slide set. So you might see that there's a bit more text on some of the slides than on others, and that's the explanation. So the research seminar is about dealing with rejection in a way that it doesn't drive you to distraction. And just rejection is something we all deal with. I'm lucky, Carol generously introduced me. I've had what would be seen to be a successful career. I'm a professor in a medical research institute. I come from a relatively lowly background. I started out as a podiatrist and an academic podiatrist, and I've sort of transcended that sort of starting point to some degree. And you know, in terms of my successes, I'm an NIHR senior investigator. I chair funding committees. I've chaired ARMA, the umbrella body for the musculoskeletal world in the UK, face to politics. I've chaired the EULAR Health Professionals Committee. I've had lots of publications, lots of grants. I've written books. I have a large and self-fulfilling cadre of researchers who work in my group. But while that's an overall picture of success, that's not representative of 30 years of nothing but success. And there's been all sorts of failures in and amongst that. So for those 120 publications, I would estimate I've probably had more than 200 rejections. For all my grant income, for every grant I put in, I probably had maybe 3 rejections. So the proportion of successes can be relatively small, but it's how it adds up is probably what ends up being important. And I guess this graph, which is a graph showing temperature change in North America over a prolonged period, goes some way towards illustrating that. So I mean, if you take something fairly recently up here in the top right hand corner, you know, there can be a downturn, there can be a hiccup in terms of weather almost for any given year, but there's no doubting from this graph that the overall trajectory here is one of increasing temperature. And I guess that's the important thing to bear in mind when you're thinking about rejection in the context of a clinical academic career or academic career, is that you really shouldn't confuse weather and the variation in the weather with climate. And hopefully you'll maintain a steady upward trajectory in terms of climate. So when you do get rejections, what sort of rejections do we have to deal with? Well, there are various ways that rejection manifests itself. Probably the hardest to deal with is rejections for funding around personal fellowships, where there's a very personal element to the application, where the application isn't just about the project or a project idea, but it's about you and the picture that you present of you. You can be rejected for project grants, where it is much more about the project, the idea and the delivery. Program grants, where reviewers, for instance, might be looking to see how the different parts of a program tie in together, and you get rejected not because of any specific problem with what you're proposing, but just that it doesn't necessarily represent an integrated program. You can be rejected by research councils, by NIHR, by industry. You can be rejected having secured funding in terms of the outputs of your research. And again, they can be quite brutal, ranging from desk rejections where the editor just says thanks but no thanks, through to rejection after reviewer comments, and you've had your hopes up and you've had some reviewer comments, some of which have been relatively positive, and you've been asked to submit revisions, for instance, and you have higher hopes that you might get it over the line, only ultimately to be turned down. And we'll go through some of the classic sort of 5 stages of grief, if you like. No, there'll be an immediate gut reaction to rejection, immediate disappointment, disbelief, anger. You worry about having to share your rejection with other people. Often you'll have had a team of maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 people involved in a research application or in a manuscript, and it feels terrible having to tell them that ultimately this may have failed. And certainly I've spent time lying in bed at night, worrying about all that. And we've got to work out how we deal with all this potential for rejection. And part of it is the context within which it happens, that there's an external perception potentially that we exist in these sort of ivory towers of academia where we drift from having a wafty question sitting under an oak tree in the sunshine to asking for some money to answer the question, and then writing up a manuscript and popping it in the post, and then on to the next idea. Whereas the reality is that academia, and particularly a research career, is a really competitive environment. And it's a competitive environment where for most people you're at the bottom of the food chain for much of your career, and it really feels like the world is pressed against you. And it's important that you're able to deal with that as a context. And part of that is that some people just aren't cut out for it. You don't have to sort of pitch yourself into this competitive environment if it's not for you. You have to go into this knowing that you're going to have to be really driven. You're going to have to be passionate about what you do, and come back again and again and again because you're convinced that your program of work, your idea, your topic area, or whatever is really important and needs to be pursued. You need to be thick-skinned. You need to be able to take the hits and deal with them, shrug them off, and come back for another go. And then ultimately, and I'm always fairly open with people who come to me looking at getting a start in research. I try and be really quite sort of black and white with them, that you have to be able to deal with uncertainty, because some of the rejections we're talking about will be rejections for funding, which ultimately pay your salary and put food on your and your family's table. And so you have to be prepared to deal with the fact that you might fall off the end, and you might have to go and find something else, and you will be on fixed term contracts, and some of those will roll over in the nick of time. Some of them you'll line something else up with time to spare, but some of them will run out, and you just have to look at where the next opportunity is, and it might not be the one that you'd initially planned. So don't go into a research career, I tend to advise people, unless they're prepared to be driven and thick-skinned and are able to deal with the uncertainty. Otherwise it will drive you mad. On the positive side, there are lots of reasons for going into research. It's really rewarding in terms of you get to use your imagination to come up with the most interesting questions, to sort of go down lines of blue sky thinking that other people would really not be able to do. In industry, for instance, you might be more constrained. In clinical practice, you're actively discouraged from being too creative. You get to be paid for answering interesting questions and finding solutions to things that intrigue you. I can think of no greater privilege than that, almost. You can have great fun. I work in an environment where the people around me are fun. I have a laboratory where we have machines that go ping, and we do all sorts of fun things, and we pursue fun lines of inquiry. And I work with some lovely people to do that. Some of the best friends I have in my life are people I've met through work, because I work with people who share a lot of my ideals and who share my inquisitiveness and have shared my journey. And talking of journeys, back in the day, one of the rewards that went with a research career was being able to see some fairly exotic places, travel the world, and generally live a fairly exotic lifestyle. That'll pass for a word, exotic lifestyle. Of course, in the current COVID climate, travel's a little bit more limited, and how it opens up afterwards will remain to be seen, and how much travel we want to do in the future will remain to be seen. But it's certainly been a very positive aspect of my life in research so far. But as I mentioned, we need to bear in mind that the research environment is a very competitive environment, and one analogy that I use quite a lot is it's akin to a professional sporting environment. So in terms of rejection and the potential for a rejection, you go into this knowing that you're going to be surrounded by excellence. So surrounded by excellent people, surrounded by excellent facilities. You're going to be well supported. The infrastructure is very strong in terms of infrastructure, technical infrastructure, grant writing infrastructure, publishing infrastructure. You're going to be well supported by excellent people, and that comes with very high expectations. So again, one of the things that you're going to be conscious of in the context of rejection is that you know that your performance is being closely monitored, and as in sport, you're only as good as your last game. In the professional academic environment, you're only as good as your results. If you don't bring in a grant, you don't bring in a grant. If your paper isn't published, your paper isn't published, and there's no hiding from that. And so the analogy with competitive sport holds up to a large extent. And in the past, I've often used team sport as being my analogy, because that's the type of sports I've been most familiar with in my life. But thinking about it more recently, it's actually even harder than that, even tougher than that, particularly for the individual, because it's a competitive sporting environment analogy, but it's where there's a judgment component. And this is where the rejection part comes in. You have somebody external to what you're doing who gets to take a view on whether they like it. So in the same way as in gymnastics, ice dancing and skating, diving, where a judge assigns a score, or essentially a measure of acceptance or rejection to what you're offering, we have a similar environment in academia and particularly in research. And so again, you've got to be prepared to live with the ups and downs, and because there are analogies with the sporting environment, you can actually draw some strengths from some of the techniques that high-level sports people use to deal with success and failure, and to deal with the process, and to make sure that you don't let it get to you too badly. Because there are almost boundless opportunities for rejection to occur, right the way through from the first germ of an idea through even after you've completed the research and had it published. When the government does its 5-yearly review in exercises like the Research Excellence Framework, you can still be rejected for stuff that you've already done. And so it goes, as I said, already from trying to get the germ of an idea past supervisors or past seniors in your department, and you raise what you think is a really good idea, and people come up with 20 reasons why they think it's absolutely rubbish. Rejection can occur in the application development phase, where people don't want to be involved in your project because they don't think it's really going to work, or it's not for them. It can occur at the funding stage. You can be bounced around during ethics approvals and governance approvals in terms of what it is exactly you're proposing to do. You feel sometimes that you're pushing things over the line just to get them past someone when the computer says no. Rejection can come when you've got the study up and running, from getting people to actually participate in your research. You can be scrutinized by people from a governance perspective and be told off. You can be paused, you can be stopped in the worst case scenario from conducting your research, even while you're up and running. You can get rejection during manuscript preparation in terms of people's interpretation of your data while you're putting manuscripts together. People's willingness to be involved and put their names to the research can be an issue. You can be rejected at the editor's desk when you finally submit a manuscript without it even ever going out to review. You can be rejected by reviewers' comments, which we'll come back to. You can be rejected by the editor's desk even when the reviewers have been largely positive. You can be criticised by your funder, who maybe doesn't like the impact of what you've done, or wants you to do more and wants to sort of push you a bit harder. And I mentioned already the ref, and I had an example in the most recent ref where I compiled an impact case study for the ref, and it fell off the end. It was decided in the end it wasn't needed. So an impact case study that I'd spent quite a lot of time preparing essentially was wasted effort. And so rejection occurs at any level in the research process, and we just have to deal with it and move on. And rejection then comes in many forms, as well as at many times in the process. It can come in many guises. So the types of rejections range from something just disappearing off into thin air and not even getting a response, to you getting a response which says, well, it just didn't fit. We're not funding this. We didn't sort of send it out to review because it didn't fit within our remit, didn't fit within what we want to fund, didn't fit within the remit of the journal, and we'll come back to that again in a second. So it just, your research just was not for us. You can get rejection with feedback that's utterly useless. It doesn't mean anything, doesn't help anything. You can get feedback where rejection, where the feedback was, in your opinion, frankly wrong, where you actually think, did they read what I wrote? Because you've just said that you're not funding it because of X, Y, and Z, and here is X, Y, and Z in my application form. You can get feedback that's good, but for whatever reason you're still rejected. I've had this with funding applications and with manuscripts on many occasions. Of course, you get fair rejections where you read the comments and you think, okay, well, I can actually improve this. I can improve it and resubmit it, or I can improve it and submit it somewhere else, or I can take this feedback on board and I can split this manuscript into two. And there are many ways in which any feedback you get along with your rejection will actually help improve things. And again, I can think of some very specific examples, particularly of fellowship applications from my group, where they've been rejected and have been desperately disappointed to have a personal fellowship rejected, with all of that means for the risk to your career and being able to put food on your family's table. But in at least 2 or 3 occasions I can think of now, those same people would look at their first application and a revised application which was successful and say, goodness, wasn't the second application improved as a result of the first round application being rejected? So you can get genuine improvements from the rejection process. Although without doubt the most painful form of rejection is the outcome that we get sometimes, particularly from funding panels, which is where your application is actually recommended for funding by the panel, but when the funder does the ranking of how much money is available versus how much is being spent on the projects that are above yours in the ranking, you actually drop off the bottom for funding being available, and you get the dreaded letter that we regret to inform you that you were considered to be fundable by the panel, but in this round you will not be funded. And dealing with that is particularly difficult, and our record for fundable but not funded is 3 rounds of NIHR doctoral and clinical doctoral fellowships, where what we know is a really good project has been recommended for funding 3 times and has been not funded 3 times, and the poor fellow who's attached to that has had to deal with being told it was good enough to be funded but wasn't. And of course, when you get your rejection, you'll go through the sort of classic stages of grief, whether you have 5, 7, 8, 9 stages of grief. There are various models, but you'll go through the, oh no, I can't believe this has happened, please, no, oh, I can't believe my funding application, my family's food on the table hasn't worked out. You get cross that they haven't understood where you came from, that they got it wrong. You'll go through the phase of, oh, what if only I could do this, then maybe we could get them to have another look or whatever. You go through the dark stages of depression and I'm never going to make this stick, I'm never going to be able to deal with this, I'm in the wrong job, I just can't do this anymore. But if you're lucky and you work at it, you'll get to the point where you realize that, okay, this has happened, I do want to do this again, I do want to pursue this as a career, I do believe in this manuscript, I do believe in this research idea and this grant application, and I'm ready to go again, and I'll dust myself down and I'll give it another go. And so there are all sorts of parallels with the stages of grief, and some of them we've mentioned already. Some of them can be really quite personal. So if you're rejected from a personal fellowship program round, funding round, for instance, it can feel really intensely personal. They did not like me as an applicant, and that really hurts. And that's different to, okay, they didn't like this bit of my project idea, or they didn't think that this bit of method was quite right for what we were proposing, and therefore they're not funding it. You can sort of shrug your shoulders and move on from that. But it can be really quite difficult to deal with a personal rejection where it was they didn't think that you were the right person to be doing the research, or they didn't think that you had the right profile to be funded in this particular funding scheme. So how do you deal with the rejection constructively? Well, you've got to start from the premise that you're not going to change the decision. You have to live with the decision that they've made. There are very, very rare exceptions to this, and we had one this year where a manuscript of a piece of work that we knew to be really high quality was rejected because they couldn't find a reviewer in the middle of the COVID pandemic. And it's a reputable open access journal, and one of their key metrics is their turnaround time. And because their turnaround time would have been adversely affected by not being able to find reviewers, they opted to reject the manuscript. And we were actually able to persuade the editor to review that decision, to allow us to resubmit the same manuscript as a new submission, so it wouldn't affect their turnaround times, and with a list of potential referees provided as part of the submission, so that he or she, the editor, wouldn't have such difficulty in sourcing reviewers. And they agreed to a resubmission on that basis, and actually that manuscript has now been published in the journal that we initially targeted to. So very occasionally you might change the decision, but it's going to be the minute exception to the rule. It's not the rule. Most of the time you've just got to suck it up, and that's the decision. Having come to the conclusion you're not going to be able to change the decision, you've got to now be at pains not to overanalyze why you might have been rejected. You'll be given some feedback in most cases, and you can read the feedback, take on board the feedback that's meaningful and is going to help you, but try not to overanalyze. Why would they think that? What did they think about that? And particularly don't lie in bed at night sort of spending hours picking apart what might have led to your rejection. It doesn't help, and it just makes you feel worse. And in particular, try not to second guess. Try not to think why a reviewer might have said X, Y, and Z. If they've said it, they've said it. That's the impression they've come to. You've got to accept the fact that either it's true or that you didn't convey the opposite appropriately or enough in your application or in your manuscript or whatever. So try not to second guess why they might have come to that conclusion. You've got to own it. Try not to take it personally, which is particularly difficult if it's about a personal fellowship and some of the criticism is about you. But it's also common to take it personally, even when it's objective criticism and it's not about you. You start to wear the criticisms that have led to the rejection as being sort of shortcomings that you introduced. And it's actually really difficult not to take personally criticisms that are about the methodology or the way you've done something. And then finally, when you're particularly when you're replying to reviewers' comments in relation to a manuscript, try not to get cross. It's really difficult when there's maybe several pages of criticism, reviewers' criticism, to not go into the first part thinking, okay, I can live with that, I can live with that. But by the time you get to the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 12th, 20th point of criticism, not to be reacting to it and going, oh, I don't agree with that, or did you even read it when we've said that already? And try not to let the criticism get to you, because you're going to have to try and work with it. As per my comment earlier on, really, about the sort of professional sport analogy, one of the adages in sport that we often hear trotted out in interviews on the TV, as athletes, racers or whatever, talking about controlling the variables that they can control, and then not worrying about the variables that are outside their control. Don't worry about the other team, don't worry about the other drivers, don't worry about whatever else. Control what you can control, and once you've identified it, genuinely own it. So if you've got a manuscript, do you fit appropriately to the journal's remit? If I work extensively in the sort of biomedical engineering field. By and large, editors of clinical journals want stuff that's going to influence practice. They don't want all the technical stuff. In the engineering space, very often they're interested in the engineering advance rather than the clinical application. So it sounds obvious, but it can often be quite difficult to fit in remit with a journal or with a funder or with a funder specific call. So try and put yourself in their shoes. What does the journal editor want for his readership or her readership? And can you adjust your story to contextualize for that readership? It's really helpful to contemporize. So having something that's contemporary in terms of what a journal editor would want, for instance, at the moment. So a good example is we had, the year before last, conducted some work on a telephone appointment system in our local foot health department, and when the COVID pandemic hit and everybody was rushing to review their services, we just recontextualized the telephone appointments follow-up audit that had been done and put it in the context of, while everybody's doing this for COVID, these are some lessons that we learned from when we did this a year or so ago. And that got straight in, and it actually wasn't a brilliant paper, but it got straight in because it was timely and relevant to the circumstances that everyone else was enduring. Make sure that you have a genuine story to tell, that you're not just in the business of communicating data, you're in the business of actually making sure that that data is communicated in such a way that the reader can take it on board and can understand the narrative that goes with it and the context within which that new bit of knowledge sits. Some review rejection comments are genuinely valid, as we've discussed previously. So, take them on board and make the next attempt better based on what you've been told. And then I'm notoriously stubborn, and I live by the adage of you just throwing yourself back in. So with all of the provisos above about improving what you're doing, I do rather hold to the adage that if all else fails, plan B should be to make plan A work and just go back again. And if you think that you're pretty much right, then tweak what you've been told to tweak, but don't be afraid to just go back in and make what you want to work. So sort of last couple of slides, be prepared to be resilient. If you're going to be dealing with rejection, accept that it's part of the process, that it's not a negative thing about you, it's just part of the process. So you are going to miss, you are going to have things bounce back, but to miss, you have to have a shot. You have to have a shot to have a chance of scoring at all. So if it's the difference between not giving something a go or giving it a go and being rejected, most often you're better off giving it a go. Our record, for instance, for journal manuscripts rejections, for again a good piece of work that deserved to be published, but we couldn't find the right home for it because of where it sat. It did fit between different remits for some of the mainstream journals. So our record for manuscript rejections is 9, but eventually it got published, and it deserved to be out there because it was new knowledge that adds to what we know. So don't be afraid to have a shot. Don't be afraid to have a lot of ideas. Again, if you're going to be coming up with good research questions, the secret is to have a lot of questions, and some of them will be rubbish, but some of them will work. So if you are going to find the Prince Charming, you might have to kiss quite a lot of frogs to get to the good ideas. And again, I've mentioned already that the record so far for our nearest miss is our 3 times fundable but not funded. So that's kissing a lot of promising frogs, but not quite yet having found our Prince Charming. And just for the record, that same application, outcomes development application, is now going back into a number of other funding sources because we know it's fundable. We get positive comments about it. We just haven't managed to get it funded yet. So in summary, you need the first thing that's the image on the left hand side is one of the images that I was going to take out because I had similar images in the original seminar that I took out because of copyright infringements and what have you. And this is a copyright infringement, and I declare it. And Liz and Molly, I apologise, but you have recognition for it, because this for me so completely tells the tale of where rejection fits in what ultimately can be quite a positive overall success story, that we do tend to think of failure and success as being the polar opposites of one another. And certainly my career doesn't look like the top picture. My career absolutely does look much more like the bottom part of the picture. So we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves when we do get rejection. It's part of the process. Be kind to yourself. Take a moment, take a day out, go and, I don't know, open a bottle of wine and put it out of your mind for 24 hours and just think life's a bit unfair. And give yourself the space to cope. But do bounce back. Be resilient. Do come back. You might have to put it into more than one place. You might have to take more than one rejection, but it's not the end of the world. Ultimately, you might well get funded. You might well get your paper published. You just need to find the right fit for it. Control what you can. Don't worry about what you can't control. Don't lie in bed at night worrying about things that you simply can't control. Just identify the things that you can control and fix the ones of those that you think will help the story, your paper, your grant application or whatever. And then finally, just don't be afraid to kiss a lot of frogs. Be prepared to have a lot of bricks. Some of them will end up blue, some of them will end up red, but you need a lot of bricks to build a wall. And finally, I had in my dealing with rejection slide a bit about not getting cross when you're dealing with pages of rejection. If over the next year or couple of years, anyone who's watch this seminar, goes through their rejection comments, and they work out how you manage to get to the end of a series of rejection or reviewers' comments without getting cross, can you let me know? Because for all the bits of advice I've given in this seminar, that's the one that I have not yet managed to master myself, and I can't deal with rejection without getting a bit cross, but do try. Thank you very much, and I hope this has been useful.
Thank you very much, Tony, for a really enlightening presentation about something that's quite dear to my heart, because I am that 9 rejected publication person, but it did get published in the end, and I have got quite a few more publications since then. So I completely understand the whole mechanism of rejection, and I love that picture of the wall. I'm going to use that, I think, somewhere in some of my other work I do, but I think you're right. Yeah, we think of it as polar opposites, but we're not. It's actually part of the whole of our life, and yeah, I think that's a really good representation. So Tony, thank you very much for giving this presentation twice. Thank you very much for coming back this time and recording it so we can put it onto the website. And yeah, thank you for an amazing presentation. Thank you.
Thank you all. Good luck.